Chapter 2. Ruy Lopez, Open Variation. We will replay the main line and the important sublines, with pauses for tactics. Welcome back to our Ruy Lopez series. In Chapter 1, we began with Anderson against Morphy, Paris 1858. Morphy showed why Black's A6 move became so important. Black asks the bishop a question, gains queenside space with b5, and looks for central counterplay before White's. Spanish pressure becomes comfortable. Now we move forward to Leipzig, 1865. The opening question changes. Instead of protecting the e4 pawn with d3, White castles. This is the move that would become the main road of the Ruy Lopez. But castling has a price. White leaves the e4 pawn undefended. So Black immediately asks the most direct question, can I simply take it with nx e4? This is the birth of the open Ruy Lopez question. Black wins a pawn and opens the position. White gets rapid development, a rook on the e-file, and chances to recover the pawn with activity. Our model game is Rosenthal against Schmidt, Leipzig 1865. It is not modern theory yet. That is exactly why it is useful. We can see the early theory being tested in a very direct form. Your job in this lesson is to understand the trade-off after White castles and Black captures on e4. Black may win the e-pawn, but if Black falls behind in development, White's activity can become more important than the pawn. e4. White starts with the classical open game move. The Ruy Lopez begins from the battle over the e-pawn. White wants central space and fast development. e5. Black answers symmetrically. Both sides now have a pawn in the center, and the knights will immediately fight over those pawns. Knight f3. White attacks e5. This is the first direct pressure point. Knight c6. Black defends e5 with development. The knight on c6 is useful, but it also becomes the target of the Spanish bishop. Bishop b5. This is the Ruy Lopez. White attacks the defender of e5. The pressure is indirect, but very real. a6. Black plays the Morphy defense. As we saw in Chapter 1, this move asks the bishop a question and prepares b5. Black does not want White to build pressure without being challenged. Bishop a4. White keeps the bishop. This bishop is the soul of the Ruy Lopez. White keeps pressure on c6 and preserves the option of bx c6 at the right moment. Let's see what happens if bishop takes c6 is played instead of bishop a4. Bishop takes c6. This is the natural student question. Why not capture immediately on c6 and then take the e5 pawn with the knight? At first glance, White seems to win a central pawn by removing its defender. D takes c6. Black recaptures. Now the c6 knight is gone, so White can try to take e5. But Black has a very important resource. Knight takes e5. This is the tempting move. White grabs the e5 pawn and hopes that the opening has already worked tactically. Queen d4. This is the point. Black's queen attacks the knight on e5 and the pawn on e4. White cannot simply keep everything. Knight f3. White saves the knight. But now the e4 pawn is loose. Queen takes e4, check. Black regains the pawn with check. So white has not won a clean pawn. Black has the bishop pair and an active queen, while white has forced an early exchange on c6. Queen e2. Queen takes e2, check. King takes e2. The queens come off. White can play this kind of exchange variation, but the point is different. White is playing for a long-term structure, not for an immediate pawn win. That is why the main Ruy Lopez move is bishop a4. White keeps the bishop, keeps the tension, and waits for a better moment to decide whether bxc6 is useful. Let's return back to the main line. Knight f6. Black develops and attacks e4. Now we reach the critical fork in the road. In chapter 1, Anderson protected e4 with d3. In this chapter, white chooses the sharper main road. Kingside castles. White castles. This is the big historical step. White does not defend the e4 pawn immediately. Instead, white brings the king to safety and puts the rook closer to the e-file. The move is logical, but it invites black's most direct reply. Let's see what happens if d3 is played instead of kingside castles. d3. This was the chapter 1 approach. White protects e4 first and keeps the center flexible. The position is quieter. Black can still develop actively, but black does not win the e-pawn immediately. Let's return back to the main line. Knight takes e4. Black accepts the challenge. This is the open Ruy Lopez. Black wins the e4 pawn and says, if white wants long-term pressure, first prove that the missing pawn does not matter. This move became one of the most important tests of the Ruy Lopez. It is not just a pawn grab, it is a statement that black will solve the center immediately. Let's see what happens if bishop e7 is played instead of knight takes e4. Bishop e7. This is the quieter closed approach. Black develops, prepares to castle, and usually keeps the center tense. Later chapters will follow this road into the closed Spanish. Let's return back to the main line. Please feel free to pause the video and find the best continuation for white. If you found rook e1, excellent. Let's see the idea on the board. Rook e1. White immediately uses the rook. This is the point of castling. White attacks the knight on e4 and tries to recover the pawn with gain of time. Notice the difference from chapter 1. With the king still on e1, the rook could not come to e1. Castling made this pressure possible. Let's see what happens if d4 is played instead of rook e1. d4. This became the main modern way to challenge the open Ruy Lopez. White strikes in the center at once. The idea is not only to recover the e4 pawn, but to open lines before black completes development. b5. Bishop b3. This is the important later structure. Black supports the knight on e4 with d5 and gains queenside space with b5. This line became a major theoretical battleground. In 1865, the opening was still more direct and less refined. Let's return back to the main line. Knight c5. Black retreats the knight. The knight keeps material balance for the moment, but this also gives white a clear target, the knight on c6 can be exchanged, and then the e5 pawn becomes vulnerable. Let's see what happens if bishop e7 is played instead of knight c5. Bishop e7. Black can also return material by developing. The practical question is whether black can complete development before white's rook and bishop pressure becomes uncomfortable. Let's return back to the main line. Bishop takes c6. White exchanges on c6. This is very concrete. White removes the defender of e5, damages black's queenside pawns, and prepares to recover the e-pawn. D takes c6. Black recaptures with the d-pawn. Black now has doubled c-pawns, but also the bishop pair and an open d-file. This pawn structure will become a recurring Ruy-Lopez theme. Let's see what happens if b takes c6 is played instead of d takes c6. B takes c6. This recapture is possible, but it gives black a different structure. The d-pawn remains on d7, so black keeps a more compact center, but the c-file structure changes. In the game, black chooses dx c6, opening the d-file and keeping the bishop on c8 free. Let's return back to the main line. Rook takes e5, check. White recovers the pawn with check. This is the first lesson of the open Ruy-Lopez. Black can take on e4, but white often gets the pawn back through activity. Now black must prove that the activity was worth the structural concession. Bishop e7. Black develops and blocks the check. This is natural, but it also shows black's problem. White's rook is already active on e5, while black still has several pieces at home. Queen e2. White supports the rook and increases pressure on e7. White's queen and rook coordinate on the e-file. Black must be careful not to fall behind in development. Bishop e6. Black develops the bishop and attacks the queen's influence. The bishop on e6 controls important squares and prepares castling. But white now takes the center. d4. White expands in the center. This is the correct reaction. White has recovered the pawn, activated the rook, and now builds a central pawn duo. Knight d7. Black attacks the rook. The knight comes to d7 and asks the rook to decide where it belongs. Rook e3. White keeps the rook on the third rank. This rook lift is the main story of the game. The rook can swing across the board later, especially toward g3 or h3 if black's king becomes exposed. Kingside castles. Black finally castles. Black has reached king safety, but white already has more space and active pieces. c4. White gains more space. White wants to restrict black and prepare nc3, b3, and bb2. The rook on e3 is unusual, but white's position has attacking potential. Knight b6. Black reroutes the knight. The knight attacks c4 and keeps an eye on d5. Black is trying to stabilize the position. b3. White supports c4 and prepares bb2. The bishop on c1 will join the long diagonal, aiming toward g7 and h8. Bishop f6. Black develops actively. The bishop attacks d4 and puts pressure on white's center. Black is trying to show that the rook on e3 may become a target. Bishop b2. White completes the long diagonal. Now the bishop on b2 and rook on e3 both look toward the king's side. White is not attacking yet, but the pieces are lined up. Bishop g4. Black pins and attacks. The bishop on g4 pressures f3 and tries to disturb white's coordination. This is a logical defensive idea. If white wants to attack, black must create counter pressure. Rook e4. White moves the rook again. The rook stays active and attacks g4. This is an old-fashioned but instructive rook lift. White uses the rook almost like an attacking piece in the middle game. Bishop takes f3. Black removes the knight. This gives white doubled f-pawns, but it also opens the g-file and gives white attacking chances. G takes f3. White accepts the doubled pawns. The structure is ugly, but the open g-file and bishop on b2 give white attacking ideas. In open games, activity can outweigh pawn structure. Queen d7. Black centralizes the queen. Black wants to defend and perhaps bring the rook to e8. But white now turns toward the king. Knight c3. White develops the last minor piece. White's pieces are ready: bishop on b2, rook on e4, knight on c3, and queen on e2. Queen h3. Black creates counterplay. The queen attacks h2 and keeps an eye on f3. Black is not simply defending, black is trying to create threats against white's king. Rook g4. White swings the rook to the king's side. This is the point of the rook lift. The rook travels from e1 to e5, then e3, e4, and now g4. White attacks g7 and threatens to open lines around black's king. Rook on the a-file to e8. Black brings the rook to the e-file. This is a natural defensive move, but now white finds a forcing way to increase the attack. Knight e4. White centralizes the knight with tempo ideas. The knight attacks f6 and supports pressure on the king's side. White's pieces are gathering around black's king. Rook e6. Black defends along the 6th rank. The rook tries to protect the king's side horizontally. This is practical, but black's pieces are now tied to defense. Please feel free to pause the video and find the best continuation for white. If you found rook e1, bishop h4, rook takes g7, check, king takes g7, d5, check, excellent. Let's see the idea on the board. Rook e1. White brings the other rook to the e-file. This is a quiet but powerful move. White doubles the pressure and prepares tactics on the e-file and g-file. Bishop h4. Black attacks. The bishop hits e1 and f2 ideas, and black hopes to distract white from the king's side. But now the tactics arrive. Rook takes g7, check. White sacrifices on g7. This is the attacking payoff. The rook on g4 captures the pawn with check and drags black's king into the open. This move also teaches the big lesson of the early open Ruy Lopez: if black spends too much time holding material and structure, white's active pieces can become dangerous very quickly. King takes g7. Black accepts the sacrifice. The king captures the rook, but now white's central pawn and bishop create a forcing attack. d5, check. White opens the bishop on b2. This is the key follow-up. The bishop on b2 now attacks along the diagonal, and black's king has no time to rest. Rook f6. Black blocks the diagonal. The rook tries to interpose on f6, but white has a direct answer. Knight takes f6. White removes the defender. The knight captures on f6, continuing the attack and clearing the diagonal. Bishop takes f6. Black recaptures. Black has survived the first wave, but white still has the bishop pair and queen activity. Bishop takes f6, check. White removes the bishop with check. The attack continues by forcing exchanges that leave black's king exposed. King takes f6. Black's king captures. Now the king is far from safety, and white's queen enters with tempo. Queen e7, check. White centralizes the queen with check. The queen on e7 attacks f8 and c7, and black's king is forced into a defensive shell. King g7. Black retreats. The king returns toward g7, but white keeps checking. Queen g5, check. Another check. White uses the queen to force the king into a passive position. King h8. Black steps into the corner. Now white can switch from checks to threats. Queen f6, check. White keeps control. The queen on f6 attacks c6 and h6 ideas, and black's king remains boxed in. King g8. Black returns to g8. The king has been pushed back, but white has one more improving move. Rook e4. White brings the remaining rook into the attack. This is very instructive. After sacrificing one rook, white uses the other rook to continue the attack. The rook threatens rh4 and re5 ideas. h5. Black gives the king an escape square and attacks the rook's path. But white has a direct winning move. Rook e5. And white won. The rook joins the queen on the king's side, and black cannot meet the threats. White threatens rg5 plus and rxh5 ideas, while black's king is trapped. This game teaches the chapter 2 lesson clearly. After kingside castles, black can take the e-pawn. But the open Ruy Lopez is not a simple pawn grab. White gets the e-file, fast development, and attacking chances. If black does not develop accurately, white's activity can become decisive. In the next historical chapters, we will see black improve the open Ruy Lopez with sharper central play, especially the later idea of d4, b5, and d5. The theory becomes less romantic and more precise, but the basic question remains the same: can black take on e4 and survive white's initiative? As we saw in this lesson, after 10. a6, black stops knight b5 and prepares to take on e5. White keeps play alive with queen e2, king h1, f4, and rook d1, and the main line reaches an equal position after bishop b5.